Thank you, Daniel. I think this is a little too tall for me, so I'm going to shorten it up. I think I might have been remiss in not welcoming those of you who have joined us on the webcast. We are glad you joined us and hope you have a great Sabbath as well. Like Mitch, I think I better set a timepiece here because I don't want to be like a friend of mine who it was in another congregation. He got up the song lead and he said that he had defended his preacher that week at work. And somebody asked him how so, and he said, this guy was really getting obnoxious at work on how well his preacher, or how good his preacher was and how he could preach. He said he can preach a half hour on almost any subject that you would like. And he said, wow, that's nothing. My preacher can talk for hours about nothing at all. So I don't want to be like that, so I want to know what time it actually is. For those of you who want a title for this presentation, this sermon, it is Torrified. It's like horrified except with a T. This is a real word. It's not a composite of several other words to make up to explain something. This is a real bona fide word that you can go to your Webster's dictionary and you can look it up and you can get a definition for it. And we'll get to a definition for it a little bit later on down the line here in a few minutes. But first I wanted to ask a question. And I'm sort of taking on where Mitch left off in a way. I wanted to ask a question. When was the last time that you really enjoyed a trial? When you just had, and I'm not talking about like the Scopes Monkey trial or To Kill a Mockingbird trial or something like that. I'm talking about a real trial that impacted you and affected you and caused you grief. Unless you're some masochistic or something, that probably has never happened to you. I don't think it's happened to me that I can recall, that I have enjoyed a trial. But as Mitch mentioned, when we get baptized, oftentimes, and I think this occurred when I got baptized, you might think, and I don't want to discourage anybody who is thinking of baptism, but you might think, yay, all my troubles are over, and everything is rosy, as he mentioned, and from now on we'll be on this path of all hugs and kisses, and everything is, as they say, hunky-dory. That's not the way it generally works. From the very beginning of Christianity, and even before that, God's way has always caused trials. Now, whether that's trials that come as a result of practicing God's way, or whether those are trials that come along in life, health issues, death of loved ones, or financial issues, any number of trials, and they could all be related possibly to attacks for practicing God's way, possibly. They probably all aren't, but they may be. And I often wonder, and this year, for some reason, I had this came to mind more than ever when we were celebrating the Day of Atonement, about what it would be like if Satan was not here. If he was not here to tempt us, if he was not here to cause us aggravation or to throw those, as it says in Ephesians, those fiery darts at us, that sometimes I'm thinking, I'm going down the road and he's sitting on the building and sees me going by and throws one just to see if he can get in between the cracks of my armor, and probably all too often he can. But at any rate, I just, for some reason, more than ever wondered what it would be like if Satan really were bound and completely out of the way. But that's a digression from where I'm going. Christianity and trials almost seems to be synonymous. It almost seems like they go hand in hand, so to speak. And I'm guessing that when the light comes on, that light is visible, and we're bigger targets than we ever have been before. We can go through the New Testament, the Old Testament too, but the New Testament, and when Christianity began, we can go through the life of Peter and see what all Peter went through, and he was in prison and other things happened to him. We don't have as much documentation about Peter as we do about Paul and some others, but nonetheless, Peter had his trials. As soon as he began to preach the gospel, as soon as he became a Christian, empowered with God's Spirit, he began to have his trials, and he had struggles with them. He overcame them, but nonetheless, it wasn't easy. Paul, as I mentioned, he had lots of trials. He was stoned. He was shipwrecked. In fact, he was stoned and left for dead. He was shipwrecked several times, I believe. He went hungry. He was robbed. There was just a whole litany, a whole list of items and things that happened to Paul to cause him grief, to cause trials and troubles for him along the way when he started preaching the gospel. And of course, Stephen, we all know the story of Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr. We would think probably that God would protect everyone, that his servants and so forth, but he didn't protect Stephen from death. He got stoned to death for preaching the gospel. So it began right away, and it's continued down to our time today, and it will continue as long as we're on this earth, as long as there are Christians on this earth. In fact, I wanted to go to the 1 Peter 4, and show you a scripture here. If you would, turn to 1 Peter 4. And Peter, as I already mentioned, had his own trials. So it wasn't like he's talking out of turn or out of school here. He had his own trials that he had to deal with, and he overcame. But in verse 12, Peter said, of 1 Peter 4, he wrote, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you as though some strange thing happened to you." Don't think it's strange. We can expect it. But he said, and here is where it gets a little interesting. He said, "But rejoice," which, when we're having trials, rejoicing seems counterintuitive, or it seems like an oxymoron. It seems like something that is not the norm. It seems like not what we would do. And then, going to James, the first chapter, as if piling on, James says in chapter 1 and in verse 2, if I can find it here, it says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience," or as my margin says, endurance or perseverance. Count it joy, James says, the brother of Christ. And Peter said, rejoice when you have trials. Rejoice. Well, how can we do that? Where is the joy in trials? As I asked at the beginning, when was the last good trial we had that we enjoyed, that we took a lot of joy in? Well, I want to explain that a little bit by the word that I mentioned, the word torrified. The definition of torrified is to subject to fire or intense heat, to parch, to roast, or to scorch. Now that's torrefaction. It's the process. Torrified is the end result, and torrefaction or torrification is the process by which this is done. Said to subject to fire or intense heat, to parch, to roast, or scorch. Wooden arrows, the Indians in some cases use this process. They would they'd have a way that they could heat arrows and sort of pass them through the fires, make spears out of them, and make them more effective in their hunting because they were harder and they could make them sharper. They were easier to use that way. Also, it's the process for making charcoal, all different kinds of charcoal, and actually several different kinds of heat pellets, and they also make a powder out of it that they use as well for heating and burning. That gives a more intense heat and a stronger flame than if you just used the wood itself. And then in the 8th century, the Vikings used to had a method of torrification that they used for making ships, or their boards, lumber for their ships, because it made it more waterproof, less or more rot resistant. It wouldn't rot so easily or so quickly, and it made a difference in their they became pretty much the master of the seas because they had better equipment than the nations or the other people around them. So they used that method, or that method, to make their ships better, to make them stronger and make them more durable, more reliable. But what I want to, the part of Torification that I want to bring up today has to do with guitars. I've loved guitars ever since, especially acoustic guitars, but all kinds of guitars, but this deals mostly with acoustic guitars. I have liked guitars ever since my two uncles brought them home to the farm where we lived when we had reunions and such. They'd come home, bring their guitars, and they'd play and sing, and I thought that was fabulous. I couldn't understand quite how a wooden box could make such beautiful sound as this. So I've always been interested in that, and I've always watched and studied to try and find out how this is done, how these guitars can sound so good. So one day, not too long ago, beginning of this year, I think it was, I was reading, as I sometimes do in some of the guitar magazines or some of the online, about the advances in guitar making, guitar building, and so forth, maybe with the bracing or with the woods that they use, because different woods will make different sounds, whether it's rosewood or mahogany, or whether it's maple or whatever, koa. There are a lot of different soundboard woods there, or backs and sides that they use for guitars that will make them sound different. There'll be just a little distinction that you can hear between the different woods. So I keep sort of an eye on that, keep track of that a little bit, and here I discovered that there was something that one company called it a vintage tone system. Another company called it, I think, something to do with tone, old tone, I think they called it. Different names they used for it, but several companies were using something, and they were using a method they called torifaction or torification. And I had not really ever heard of this. I probably was aware of it to a small degree because I knew that the process of making charcoal used this method, but I didn't know what it was called. So I decided that I was going to study into it a little bit further. I ended up being in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I realized I was only a few miles from one of the oldest and largest guitar companies in the world, and that makes some of the best guitars in the world. So I decided to take a trip over there, which I did. I toured their factory, and I talked to one of the guys that works for that company. He gave the tour, and then, of course, he could answer some of my questions. And the long and short of it is that the guitars, what they were doing, they were taking the tops, and they were heating them. They were exposing them to heat, and in this way, they claimed that they could make a 80-year-old guitar out of a brand new guitar. And I was a little skeptical about that. I did play a couple, and they do sound very, very good, and I'm sure there's a lot to it because it's a scientific method to do it. They would put it in a kiln, and they would heat it up from several times. They'd heat it up, and then they'd back it off and cool it off, heat it up, back it off, cool it off, and so on, several times till they got it to the point where they wanted it. But they'd heat it up to like 250 to 400 degrees in that range, back and forth, several times, a number of times, and then they would cool them, and finally, when they were just how they wanted them, they'd bring them back out. But they had to do this without oxygen, because if there was any oxygen involved got to the tops, they would either burst into flames or they'd become charcoal, and the whole thing was ruined. So they had to do it without oxygen so that they got the desired result. It didn't sound real joyous to me, except I guess, in the end result. But that process, and as it relates to human beings, doesn't sound all that joyous. And there are many, many examples of what we would call fiery trials, as Peter put it, in the Bible, all the way back to the beginning, and especially in the book of Acts, of fiery trials that happened to people. Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, Daniel, and the apostles all went through their own forms of torrefaction or torrification, and they became, so to speak, torrified because they went through that fiery trial process. But there's one example that has always been one of the most marvelous stories in the Bible to me, and it probably is to you too. It's found in Daniel, back in Daniel, the 3rd chapter, and you probably know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think it's one of the more compelling stories of trials and surviving or facing and going through trials that is related in the entire Bible. It's a story that's fascinating, and if we look at it carefully, we will find that it's a story that we can possibly use for ourselves. Now, we're talking about where the joy is in trials, and we're getting to that, but let's look at this particular story in Daniel, the 3rd chapter. You probably recall, going back in the book of Daniel, the story of Daniel and his 3 companions. They, as a result of the fact that the nation of Judah in Jerusalem, with their headquarters in Jerusalem, of course the nation's 10 northern tribes of Israel had long since been gone into captivity many, many years before, but now Judah had become so corrupt and had gotten so far away from God and from God's law and practicing God's way of life, which they were supposed to be an example to the nations around them of God's way of life. And now they had gotten to the point where they were so corrupt that God decided it was time that He would chastise them and that He would bring a trial on them, which He did. In the crossfire between that, Daniel and his 3 friends had been taken when Nebuchadnezzar came and he besieged or surrounded Jerusalem, and he finally conquered Jerusalem, and then he took captives, and Daniel and his 3 friends were part of that captivity that was taken to Babylon from Jerusalem. And those 3 fellows, of course, they were sort of the cream of the crop, if you will. They were... The King Nebuchadnezzar had asked for his the folks who were captives and guards over them to select out some of the finest, the best, those who were the best looking, in whom there's no blemish, in whom that can be taught the literature and taught the culture of Babylon at that time, and who are fast learners. He had asked for them to be separated and to be taught. They actually ended up in the royal academy, so to speak, of Nebuchadnezzar, to learn and to be, so that they could be useful in the empire, which really was a rather brilliant thing to do, because here you have somebody that actually has knowledge, who is has aptitude and so forth. You might as well take advantage of those resources, and King Nebuchadnezzar did. Now the question is, or one of the questions is, how is they were captured and they were taken away, Judah was, as captives. A lot of them were killed, but some of them were taken captives because of the fact that they were so corrupt and did not practice God's way. The question would be, how did these 3, or these 4, how did they end up being so staunch in the way of God? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but nonetheless, these were the best, and these were the ones who practiced God's way of life, because here they were in captivity, and they manipulated their surroundings to the fact where they didn't have to eat unclean meats or unclean foods. And I'm guessing they also had to do the same thing for the Sabbath, because I doubt seriously that the Babylonians were Sabbath keepers. There's no indication anywhere that they were, and I'm sure they weren't. So I'm guessing that they also had to manipulate those kind of issues. They learned that if you turn back to Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and in verse 4, and you can keep your place. We're coming right back to Daniel. But in Deuteronomy chapter 6, well, let me see if I got the right thing. I guess would help if I went to chapter 6 instead of chapter 5. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It's called the Shema, I think is the way you pronounce it in Hebrew. And this is one of the tenets of which the Hebrew, or Judah, and probably the Jews to this day, one of the things that they preach very strongly. Verse 5, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." This is what they taught, and this is what they preached. It says, verse 6, "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." That's a 24/7 job that is commissioned here. "You shall bind them as a sign on your hand," verse 8, "and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." This is what their children were to be taught. Somehow, these three incorporated this into their life. Somehow they made this the centerpiece of their entire life and practiced it. Because as we get into the story here, in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. It was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And it was probably gold-plated. I doubt that there was that much gold in Babylon, but nonetheless, it was an image of gold. And he required all of those who were anybody, in other words, the governors, any type of leadership position, role, he required them to be there, and they were going to have a dedication ceremony. And at this dedication ceremony, they were going to have a lot of festivities, music, and so forth. And the requirement was going to be that they were going to bow down. They were going to have to bow down and worship this particular image or this idol. It was probably one of the, I forget what the god was, Nebo or some god like that. It was probably one of their gods to something. And it was probably a pretty important one, maybe a god of administration or government or whatever it was. Nonetheless, they were required to bow down to this god, and they were required to do it when the music started playing. So the music starts playing. Everybody bows down except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They did not bow down, and they were not going to bow down. There was a lot of, if you sort of read between the lines as you're reading the story going down through here, you realize that there was jealousy involved. I'm guessing the way it was phrased, it sounded like that the Jews were probably looked down upon. They were probably not held in very high esteem. They were probably more despised than other parts of the province. And they had other sections that were of the Babylonian province that were not necessarily, that they had captured and that they had taken in other words. Also probably as well as Judah. But when this happened, of course, there were those who were all too anxious and ready to come to King Nebuchadnezzar and say, "Hey, you know what? Did you notice? Those 3 Jews out there did not bow down when the music began. They did not take place in the worship of your idol. They're insubordinate. They are not devoting or giving their loyalty to your particular empire and kingdom. So, this created a dilemma. This was a problem. Here we have these three who are bucking the system, and they have to be an example made of. Now, while all this was going on, when he had mentioned that, hey, if you don't come and bow down, we have this furnace over here, and anybody that does not bow down will be thrown into the furnace. Real life torrification, real life fiery trial. Anybody that will not comply is going to be thrown into the furnace, and that will be the end. This will be the last that you'll see of them. So, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king. Now, you have to realize here are three young men. They're not, we don't know for sure how old they were, but they could have been in their early 20s or something like that, or maybe even early, or younger. But nonetheless, they were in a foreign land surrounded by hostile people in general. They were not in their comfort zone, in the comfort of their own environs where they at least had some supporters. That wasn't happening here. It doesn't say, but Daniel apparently was not there. Maybe he was off on some business. He could have been sick, or who knows why he wasn't there. But Daniel was not included in this. Of course, he had his own trials later on. But nonetheless, they were being called into question for this. And in verse 16, it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king. And this is, I don't think they did this in arrogance, or I don't think they did this out of pride or anything. I think they just, this was their conviction. Said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't have a need to answer you in this matter. We don't really have to answer you in this matter." First of all, I should have mentioned that when Nebuchadnezzar brought him up to the front to speak to them, that he had offered them a second chance, that he had offered them the chance he was going to have the music playing again, and when the music comes on, if you will just do what you're told, we'll forget about the whole thing, and everything will be forgotten and forgiven, and you can go back to whatever you were doing. But that's not what happened. That's not what they said they're going to do. They had already, they knew immediately, they didn't even have to think about it, what they were going to do or what their response was going to be. Their response was, if that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. Now that takes some strong backbone to do that. This is the most powerful man in the world at that time that they are talking to, and they are standing up for what they believe without hesitation, without a second thought. They're not thinking, well, you know what? We could, after all, we know this idol is nothing. We can bow down to this idol, and we can just make it look like we're doing that. We don't really have to actually, in our mind, think this. They could have said that. They could have said, hey, it's a little thing. It'll pass. We'll go on to the next thing, and so forth. But they didn't. They said, if this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. And here's the thing. Here is what always fascinates me and what I marvel at. But he said, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, even if he does not protect us. He didn't protect Stephen, and there were others that he didn't protect as well. But even if he does not protect us, it doesn't matter, they said, because let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold images which you have set up. We're not going to do it. It's in violation of our belief. We cannot do that in front of the whole world. Bow down to your king, to your idol, and worship him, because it's not the one true God. It's not the Lord, their God, who they were to serve with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their strength. This was not that God, and we are not going to do it. I think as we look at this, and it can encourage us, it can help us possibly to use their attitude when we face severe trials, whether it's direct persecution like this was, or whether it's from health issues or sickness. But this, I would venture to say, was not a very joyful experience. It wouldn't seem so to me. It would be hard to look at this and say, let's count this all as joy. It would be difficult, I would think. But let's go back and see if we can make some sense out of all this and see where the joy of torrification or the joy of trials come from. Going back to the guitars, old guitars are better. If you had an 80-year-old Martin guitar, we might get $500,000 for it. They go for extreme amounts of money because there's not a lot of them, and they are that much better. But why? The torrefaction process, or the trial through fire process in guitars and in humans, works a little bit the same way. It cooks out, when they're put into a chamber, and they are heated up to 400 degrees, it cooks out the volatiles, the toxins. It cooks that out of them. It brings that out of them. And the impurities. It brings the impurities out of that old wood, or of that new wood, actually. The oils, the resins, sugars, moisture, all of that is dispersed and dispensed with in that heated chamber. It all becomes, the composition of that top, and it's thin, becomes different. It almost becomes calcified. It becomes better. It becomes less susceptible to outside influence. It becomes less susceptible to humidity. And wooden instruments are very susceptible to humidity. It causes them to crack, or it can cause them to warp. It can cause all kinds of problems, as well as the music is not as good. Heat, cold, and extremes of any kind do not affect it as much. The same thing, to some extent, can happen to us. It makes a better instrument, and it also makes better people. When we suffer some of the trials, no, we don't really want to, or no, it's not really joyful, or at least it doesn't seem joyful at the time, but it does make a difference. We will become different people. There are experiences that are life-changing, and I'm sure that some of you may have had those. You become a little bit different in your personality because you become maybe a little less, shall we say, you become more if I can find the word, you become more serious about things. You begin to take things a little bit more seriously, and you begin to take life more seriously, and you realize that, hey, life is important, and what I do makes a difference. I am sure that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were changed. I am sure that it had an effect on their life once they went through there. It did things changed immediately, because in verse 28 and 29 and 30, we see that, first of all, let's just finish the story. And the story was that after they declined and after they told Nebuchadnezzar this, they took their clothes and their hats and everything, and they bound them hand and foot, They heated the furnace up, as you have heard probably many times or read many times. They heated it up to 7 times hotter than it was. It was so hot when they had the bellows out there. It was so hot that even those who came and tossed them into the fire burned up or were killed by the heat. But as it says here, when Nebuchadnezzar looked into the furnace, the fiery furnace, he was amazed. He was surprised because he said, weren't there 3 people that we put in there? He said, well, there are 4 in there now, and one of them looks like the Son of God, or a son of the gods, I guess, as it really is. But he realized that something miraculously was happening here, was going on here. Here he has these 3 people whose clothes were on them, very volatile, very flammable, threw them in there, and the only thing that was gone he could see was the bonds or the bands that they had tied them with, the rope or whatever they used, probably rope, that they used to tie them was the only thing that was gone. When they came out, they didn't smell like smoke. The fire had not touched them in any way. They didn't even have their hair singed. Not one thing different than what they were when they went in, except for the bonds being gone. So in verse 29, he said, after all this and after they were out and he had talked to him, he said, in 28, he said, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made as an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. They did make a difference. They made a difference there, and it made a difference in their own life. Even in verse 30, it says, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So there was an immediate upgrading, if you will, or an immediate blessing from it, if you will. But more importantly, long term, there is going to be, or there is, even a greater benefit to them, as well as to anybody who practices God's way and goes through the trials, the torrification, or the fiery trials that come their way. There will be benefits immediately, and there will be benefits long term as well. That things changed here, as we say, but if you go on further, you'll find out that there, in a couple of years, there was a regime change, and of course, when that happens, all bets are off. I was talking to one of my customers this week, and he had gone to the bank, and he had loaned, I think, $1.5 million. He built a big building, and he was a new store that he was putting up, and he had it just the way he wanted it, the terms, the conditions they had bargained, agreed with, and so forth. And then some other bigger bank came in and gobbled him up and bought the bank, and now all of that is down the drain, and he ended up buying out his loan through some private loans he got, and then he's going to have to find another bank to refinance him to the point that he is comfortable with, because it wasn't going to happen. But that's what happens when there's regime change like there was here. Things change, and it did with Belteshazzar, his son, and forget what his name was exactly, but his son, Nebuchadnezzar's son, came in, and he became king, and then everything changed, and they were back to not quite square one, but they were back to being different. We actually are tied together with these 3. If you turn to Hebrew, the 11th chapter, and we call this the faith chapter, and it's rightly so. It's a whole list of people, a whole list of people and things that happened to people going through this entire chapter. And while Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are not specifically named here. They are implicitly named. It's implied that who was talking to. In verse 33, it says that at the end of it, through faith, this is what happened, that faith stopped the mouth of lions, which there are two people, I think, that are spoken of as having fought lions, and that was David and Daniel. And this is probably referencing or indicating one or probably both of those. But then in verse 34 it says, and they quenched through faith, they quenched the violence of fire, which is probably specifically talking about these three. But dropping on down, he said, all of these, and we are, as I mentioned, we are tied to them in this way. 39, all of these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. In other words, they won't be entering into eternal life till the same time we do, is basically what it indicates. And then it goes on, it says therefore, and it goes on to talk about some other things. But torrefaction or fiery trials changes things. It changes in guitar tops, for example, it changes the composition, the chemical composition of the guitar top. In human beings, it also changes things. It makes us better. It makes us able, as James said in verse 2 of chapter 1, he said, it makes us more enduring. It helps us to learn endurance. It causes us to learn patience. It changes us for the better. Guitars make better music when they get older. They sound better. They have better. They have a more chime-like or a more bell-like ring to them the older they get, because they get drier and they get more resonant. They vibrate. The tops vibrate better, and therefore create and cause more and better music to come out, as well as volume. More volume comes out. These fiery trials can do several things. They can consume us if we let them. They can eat us up. They can cause us to get discouraged and to give up. They can cause that if we let it. But if we look back at some of the examples, and you could look through the whole entire chapter of Hebrews 11, or you can go back to some of those things like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and you can take those examples. We can incorporate them into our life, and we can begin to use those examples to inspire us. We can use those examples to help us to be better, and we can look at those as we face a trial and realize that the joy in trials is in the perspective, how we face the trial. If we realize that, hey, this is for our good, this will make us better in the long run, now and in God's kingdom, it'll make us better. We can look at it that way and gain benefit from it, or we can, as I said, we can let it consume us. The joy in trials is not the same as when we get that nice fuzzy little new puppy that we have, and how much we enjoy it or how much we like it. Or when maybe we have a little too much wine and we get a little too joyful. It's not like that. It's not that kind of joy. It's an enduring joy that comes with the self-satisfaction of knowing that we have done the right thing, that God has been in our heart, our soul, and all our strength has been given to God, like these young men did, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's the type of joy that James or Peter, and in other places, that's the type of joy that is being spoken of. It's a joy that is much, much deeper than just a happy smile or a happy look on our face. It's a joy from knowing what we are accomplishing, that it's making us better, that we're going to continue to get better on into God's kingdom. We have not, it says in one place, we have not yet faced these things unto blood. And most of us haven't. Some of the people listed here in Hebrews 11 have. They resisted all kinds of extremes, up to life itself. But we generally have not done that. But as we look around, it's a sobering fact that as we look at the world today and what is happening and how we can almost see it. We went to the feast in Alaska, for example, one year. When we got there, the snow was at the top of the mountain range behind our hotel. But as the days went on, we could see the snow creeping down, and we knew eventually, and the local people told us, eventually that snow will come all the way down the mountain, and it'll cover the whole city of Anchorage. And that's a little bit like this is. We can be out, we can look at the world at large, and we can see that that world is creeping in on us closer and closer and more and more. Whether it'll get here to where the extremes of chapter 11 here, the faith chapter, in our lifetime, who knows? But I know Paul thought it would be there in his life, and so did some of the other people in the New Testament. And on down the line, Herbert Armstrong felt that surely it would be there in his lifetime, and so did his son. And then my dad, he felt that he would be here to see Christ return, and all these things happen. It didn't happen in any of their lifetimes. They're gone. But at some point, it will happen, and we have to be prepared mentally and spiritually to face whatever happens and whatever comes along. It's up to us to prepare ourselves, to get ready. Whether it comes in our lifetime or not, there still will be trials that we have to face, that we will need to look at and that we will have to overcome. There always are, and there always will be. As I mentioned, it seems like a way of life for Christians. It really does. If you would turn to Hebrews the 12, well, we're pretty much right there, Hebrews 12, and we'll start in verse 1. It says, "Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Now that is our ultimate goal. We won't be at the right hand like Jesus of God, like Jesus Christ was, but we will be at the throne of God. Remember some of the Beatitudes and some of the other areas in the Bible where it tells us, or in the second and third chapter of Revelation, where the 7 letters to the 7 churches, it says, "To him that overcomes will I grant to do this, or grant to do that, or grant to be with me on my throne," and so forth. Those are all the things that we are looking forward to. The joy and the rejoicing that we do concerning the fiery trials that we are to face will cause those things to happen. That's what James and that's what Peter was talking about. As he said here in verse 11 of chapter 12, "No chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." And that's what we're looking for. That's why we need to look at, no, it won't be, as I mentioned, like some of the superficial joy that we have when things go our way, but it will be a rejoicing and a joy that is enduring, and one that we can be assured of will be everlasting.